Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, and thank you so much for your patience. My name is Gaha, and I'm the librarian for the Black Cultural Center. We're going to start this evening by having Maime Butler read some acknowledgments, and then I'll be introducing our panelists after that. Maime?
Thank you, Eula. The first thing I want to do is kind of acknowledge the land that Purdue is on. And so I'm going to read the acknowledgement from the Native American Cultural Center. The NACC acknowledges the traditional homelands of the indigenous people, which Purdue University is built upon. We honor and appreciate the Bodoak, Lenape, Miami, Shawnee, who are the original indigenous caretakers. I also want to acknowledge that tonight we'll be talking about a range of issues regarding mental health in the Black community. These issues may strike a chord for many folks who are on this call. Our hope is that as we navigate this talk, we can provide some resources, and we'll begin with one resource to start off with that we hope can be really helpful as you navigate listening to this talk. It might be triggering or challenging for some folks to engage in this dialogue, and we want to honor and respect everyone who is present. We know that myself, David, and Eula, and Meredith are people coming to this conversation with our own lenses, our own skill, our own expertise, and we do not speak for the whole of the Black community and offer our lens and our perspective to this conversation. Yeah. So now that that is out of the way, the acknowledgements, I want to pass it back to Eula for introductions, and then we'll get into one of the resources. We'll have many, but one of them.
Thank you so much, Maime. And yeah, so I'm grateful to introduce to you Maime Butler. They joined CAPS as a staff therapist and Black student liaison. Originally from Oakland, California, they graduated from Dillard University in New Orleans. Maime also graduated from Western Michigan University with a master's in counseling psychology, where they are currently finishing their doctoral work. Maime's clinical orientation includes treatment from a social justice / equity / multicultural lens, relational cultural theory, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, and self-compassion. Clinical interest areas include race-based trauma and stress, racial, gender, and sexual identity, LGBTQ+ issues, trauma, mood-related and anxiety disorders, holistic practices, spirituality, first-generation college students, training, outreach, and workshop facilitation. Meredith Stravers spent nearly 2 decades as a community college administrator and completed her associate's, bachelor's, and master's degrees as a solo parent and full-time employee. Her formal education is in family life education and family studies, and she is a certified coach. Meredith was born and raised in Battle Creek, Michigan, and currently lives in Kalamazoo with her 2 children, Jaden and Josie, and a very temperamental chihuahua named Lily. Meredith left her leadership position in higher education to co-found the Truth and Titus Collective, an organization aimed at living into the world of collective liberation we all dream about. The Truth and Titus Collective rests on the shoulders of Sojourner Truth, who settled in Battle Creek, and Francis Titus, Truth's best friend and partner in the suffrage and abolition movements. TNT specializes in interactive, embodied learning that brings anti-racism and anti-oppression work into institutions and communities. Truth-telling is the core heartbeat of both Meredith's experience and TNT. Meredith believes in ancestral rootedness as a pathway to reparations, healings, Healing and Liberation. David Rollock, Ph.D., is 150th anniversary professor and professor of psychological sciences at Purdue University. Dr. Rollock has served as head of the department, as Director of Clinical Training for Purdue's Clinical Psychology Doctoral Program, and as Director of the Purdue Psychology Treatment and Research Clinics. He is an affiliated faculty member of Purdue's African American Studies and Research Center and is Adjunct Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology, Department of Psychiatry, Indiana University School of Medicine. Dr. Rollock earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from Princeton University and his master's and doctorate in clinical/community psychology from Yale University. His empirical research, teaching, and applied interests center on mental health and adjustment among individuals of African American, Latinx, and Asian backgrounds. Dr. Rollock is 2021 to 2022 president of the Indiana Association of Black Psychologists. He has chaired the Purdue Black Caucus of Faculty and Staff, served as convener for the Purdue Sexual Harassment Advisors Network, and chaired the Purdue University Teaching Academy. Dr. Rollock is president of the West Lafayette Police Merit Commission. In 2018, the university named him one of its inaugural 150th anniversary professors for sustained, outstanding, high-impact teaching, student mentorship, and contributions to the academic, career, and personal development of students. In 2019, the American Psychological Association's Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race presented him with its Charles and Shirley Thomas Award for mentorship. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, all of our panelists. I believe that now Maime is going to lead us through some breathing exercises, after which I'll share a resource guide created for this event. Maime, I'd like to turn it over to you for these breathing exercises now.
Thank you. So acknowledging the breadth and depth of this type of conversation and its impact on Black and Brown bodies, before we get started, I want to give us a tool for managing how we get through the rest of this conversation. And I hope that it truly isn't as, I hope I'm not scaring anyone with the topic or the need to breathe and to have these tools and resources. And I acknowledge the world that we live in today, the different experiences people might be going through. And I hope that this conversation can be healing and powerful in many ways. And breathing is one of them. So I'm gonna ask that everyone take a deep breath with me. Ask that you breathe to the count of 5, hold for 4, and exhale through your mouth through the count of 5. I'm gonna count. Feel free to just breathe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold, 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 hold. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold, 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 hold. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As we navigate this conversation, I hope that regardless of what you're feeling, you can attune yourself to your breath, pay attention to it, and take deep breaths as needed. Be sure to use that breath whenever you feel stressed or anxious during this conversation. Our chat box will be used as a function to engage in dialogue. If you have any questions that come up, comments, concerns, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we will be responding to questions as we navigate this dialogue today. So the flow will be us having an open discussion about several topics around mental health in the Black community. We are open to engaging in questions throughout the dialogue. Eula?
Thank you so much, Maime. I also wanted to make everyone aware that I've culled together some resources, and we have a slide with the link to those resources. This link will take you to a research guide, and there are a lot of resources included on it, including online resources, some books that are held in Purdue University libraries, including the Black Cultural Center Library. There are some podcast episodes, and a great number of other resources that you'll see. That's just a screenshot of part of the guide. So that's what it looks like. And as a screenshot, you can't really scroll down to see it, but there's a whole lot more than just what is captured there. So we'll be showing that link again at the end of tonight's discussion. And I will also put the link to that guide in the chat. At this point, we're going to go ahead and get started with our panelists. The first thing that they'll be discussing is what is distress versus stress? What does it look like? How does it feel? And how might that manifest, either stress or distress?
I think one thing that I want to kind of bring out onto the table is how we started this conversation with acknowledging the impact of this conversation and the breathing exercise and why it's important to, one, acknowledge the impact, and two, provide things like breathing. I recently went to a workshop and what they had was the Breathing Project. And it is a project really dedicated to breathing while Black, recognizing that oftentimes it's hard, quite literally, for Black folks to breathe, and for many reasons. So when you think about what kind of creates the context of not only this conversation, but the issue of just breathing itself, it kind of makes me aware of the physical toll that mental health or distress can take on the body. And so I want to open that up to Meredith and David to also chime in on as far as distress, what it looks like, its impact on you physically, mentally, to chime in wherever. I want to kind of name this thing. I've been reading a lot of articles and seeing some things on Instagram about aging as Black folks and how Black women are aging at 7.5 years faster than white women. And part of what the discussion is about is how the impact of racism on the body. I said this with Meredith and David, I don't know, one of the conversations that we had in preparation for this, that racism is a public health crisis. And it is that because of its impact on not only our mental health, but the physical and emotional toll that it takes on our bodies.
Thanks for that overview, Maime. I think that the distinction between stress and distress is an important one. We as Black folks live and understand what stress is. Stress is that condition when, as some psychologists talk about it, when there's an imbalance between challenges that we face in the environment and the resources that we have to deal with it. At some level, stress is good because it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us vigilant. It keeps us alert. It keeps us ready for action when we need it. However, when stress is chronic, when it's unrelieved, when it's unpredictable, when the resources that we have to address it are inadequate to the challenges that we face, that's when we begin to feel the toll, and that's when distress begins to set in. And when I think of distress, I tend to think of, as you mentioned, where does it rest in the body? What toll does it take on our systems? I also think about what toll does it take on our thought processes? Does it make us scattered? Does it slow us down? Does it make us overthink things? And also, what is the toll on our feelings? How do we feel happy? Do we feel sad? Do we feel anxious? Do we feel disconnected? And those are the signs that distress has set in. And that's about the time we need to be thinking about doing something different to raise our level of ability to address the challenges that we face, or do what we need to do to reduce the challenges, like you did with that wonderful breathing exercises. That brings the level of challenge down for me and helps me to focus.
For me, I think when I think about the difference between stress and distress, stress for me feels like something that is more temporary. It's something that usually we have some tools to deal with immediately. Distress feels like something that lodges, right? It's something that stays, and often because we don't deal with stress, right? And you'll hear me talk a lot about generational impact on our bodies in regards to stress and distress, right? So, and I've shared this story with y'all before around, I think sometimes when we're talking about mental health and we're talking about distress, we think that what we are experiencing and dealing with sits in the here and now, when in reality, it sits in often generations of untreated and unhealed trauma and harm. Briefly, I shared with y'all before around how my lungs are permanently damaged. I only have the equivalent of one lung. And what I learned later, when you think about what I was told by someone who does acupressure, is that oftentimes lung conditions, breathing, inability to breathe, comes from unresolved grief, unprocessed grief. And before I was born, my uncle drowned, and my grandfather would not allow the family to grieve. They weren't allowed to cry. They weren't allowed to express any emotion. And so when we think about epigenetics, and we think about the way that generational trauma lodges, and we think about the way that things continue to play out, there were a series of things that led to my condition here. And I would also say that, like, some of the generational stuff plays a role in how our current mental health and how our bodies respond to what's happening, what's going on. So for me, like, that is distress, right? That's not stress. That's a lodged, continuous thread that has been alive for generations.
I think one of the themes that I'm hearing from some of what we've talked about is that there's a continuum that one can experience stress to a point. There's no firm dividing line before it turns into distress.
Yep.
And it can manifest in multiple channels, including in our bodies. And we can carry that around until we begin to name it, until we begin to acknowledge it, until we begin to think it through or work it through. Sometimes individually, and sometimes with others who care and can understand, or at least listen to what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think about the ways, the impact. So the things that cause the stress and how that shows up, and how that might look like anxiety, panic attacks, how that might look like, depression, how that might look like other co-occurring things coming up, and how we talked about how like we've been conditioned within our own families to navigate our health, our mental health, our emotions. And part of that is when you feel distressed, there are different ways in which you navigate it. Maybe disconnecting from the mental and emotional aspect of stress, and not being aware of the physical way in which stress is manifesting in your body. And so one thing I like to always point out, because I think this happens to me. I was on vacation last week, and I was visiting vacation because I worked the whole week, right? And so one of the things that I found happened is I started having some really bad inflammation. And so I recognized that stress, sometimes when you have downtime, when you're not busy, you get sick. You have stomach issues, you have inflammation, if you will, you have other things that happen physically as a manifestation of the stress, of the distress specifically, that impacts your body physically. But there's no connection to like, oh, I'm stressed, so this is what's happening, this is the result. And so oftentimes, I think it's important to notice, have awareness around reintegrating this disconnection of all. I think it's true for trauma. As Black folks, there is much trauma that exists historically through racism in the United States, through watching brutality happen to Black folks on the TV or on social media. And so the ways in which trauma functions as this disconnection of all these parts. You have your mental, emotional, and physical selves kind of disconnect from your body, and having to pull those pieces back together. And I think oftentimes we're taught to not do that, to like just keep going forward, right? Put your head down, keep moving, dig your feet in the mud deeper if you have to, but you have to kind of push through it. And pushing through it is deadly for many folks.
Well, and even, right, so we're also socialized though to feel shame about the way it manifests, right? So now I want to talk about that for a second, because I'm very like, mental health is something I talk about all the time, and I'm telling everyone I know, like, get a therapist, especially right now. I don't play around with that. People that know me are probably tired of me telling them to do that, but I remember over the summer, so first of all, I left higher education and the ridiculous, like, wild, pressurized environment that is. And I've been out of it for 3 years now. And my body is still adjusting to being able to come out of that, right? So this summer, I have this therapist who I love and adore, who does all of the things that I ask her to do, which is to always take me to the mats with my own self, right? And over the summer, I couldn't get out of bed, and I was tired of cooking. Y'all, I'm sure y'all are all tired of cooking. Like, I'm tired of cooking. I have 2 kids, and I just had no motivation. I didn't want to do anything. I had a lot of shame because I felt lazy. And that's a term I don't believe there is laziness. I think laziness, what we define as laziness, is actually cues that we need rest. So I had been meeting with her every other week for I don't know how long, and I had never mentioned this to her. And so finally one day it got so bad that I said something to her about, like, this has been going on for me. And she said, Meredith, how long has this been happening? And I told her, and she says, you're depressed. And I was like, I am? I'm not just, but I couldn't even bring myself to acknowledge to myself that I was feeling this way, because there is this guilt that comes, or the shame that comes with now wanting to get out of bed, with now wanting to make your kids food, with not being able to, like, take care of yourself. And I didn't know it was depression. And then she shared with me that rather than fighting depression and how I was feeling, to actually give myself permission to take the rest I needed, because my body was telling me I needed to stop, and that it wasn't shameful to need to stop, that I actually needed to rest.
Yeah.
And not having to fight that shame allowed me to treat depression in the way I needed to be okay. I'm still struggling, but I'm working at not carrying the shame of what it means to have that signal, right? Like that when when my body tells me I need to rest, it's easier for me to listen to that now instead of be like, you got to keep going, right? But we are socialized in grind culture. We're socialized that you're not allowed to rest. And if you rest, you're lazy, you're unproductive, you're not motivated. And that's one example of the way that it manifests. And we're not allowed to let it tell us what it's trying to tell us. You know what I mean? So that's coming up for me when we talk about how does it manifest? Do we let ourselves be present with the way that it does manifest so we can do something different with it, right?
Right. And how do we hold the emotions around it?
Right.
Or do we allow ourselves to feel that?
Right. Meredith, thank you so much for sharing that. That's, I think, very, very, for me, I think that's a liberating example of what it means to sort of call what we're holding in and what we feel about what we're feeling. For a lot of the Black folks that that I've worked with therapeutically, there are certain problems that we can acknowledge and some that we can't, as both you and Maime have said. It's okay to keep grinding. It's not okay to feel depressed. That's something that people with too much time in their hands and too much privilege are able to talk about. It's either your faith or your stick-to-itiveness. That's what's going to take you through. But things like depression, things like anxiety are real, and they come from a variety of sources. But often enough, we're told to buck up. Masculinity in African American communities and femininity in African American communities often are tied up with sometimes unrealistic visions of strength, and strength in the sense of swallowing or holding down what it is that we're feeling, not strength in the sense of being able to open up and navigate those spaces. So your courage in being able to talk about those kinds of things is profound. But it reveals a truth about the way in which sometimes we're socialized to think about these issues. Very important stuff.
And strength is exhausting. Like we are full humans with a full spectrum of emotions, and like that stereotype is dangerous. Absolutely. It is something that like dehumanizes us and puts us into this very specific box around how we're supposed to show up in this world. And and this notion of grit, right? Like when I hear teachers talk about grit, I'm like, no. Oh.
Let's not get started on that construct. Yeah, there are a number of problems with that. Yeah. Your point is well taken. There's the archetype of the strong Black woman. There's John Henryism, talk about the steel driving man. Those are archetypes that we are often, for lack of a better term, saddled with, that can have harmful consequences, as you described.
And I think it goes into the next portion of this discussion, but Eula, I see you unmuted several times. I want to give you some space.
Oh, no. I wanted to let you know that someone from the audience wrote, this is helpful. I've been trying to convince myself and my friends that a lot of these sudden, unexplainable resolves on their own illnesses we've had are trauma/stress related. Thank you for acknowledging this. And yeah, Maime, I was looking for a good segue into talking a little bit more about stigma and the values associated with what is and is not appropriate to talk about in terms of the Black community.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, a lot of what has been shared are very clear, like, pictures of how we engage in conversation around mental health in the Black community. I know for me, I grew up in a family where mental health wasn't really labeled as mental health issues. No one knew the language around it. But it was oftentimes like, oh, that's crazy Uncle Joe, or that's, you know, Ed, who's a little special. And the language around how we categorize things that are mental health issues has been something that, you know, we've internalized or we've pushed away and separated ourselves from. Something that I think happens often is mental health issues, depression, anxiety. Oh, that's like for white people, right? That's not for Black people. We don't have those experiences, but we do. And so the stigma around mental health itself, the words we use to categorize or to label, and the values associated with talking about it, with feeling feelings, with dealing with things that come up for folks. It's often, you know, pray about it. And I will say, praying about it, absolutely, yes. And you can talk about it with your friend. You can do other things outside of praying about it. So I think that, like, faith has always been something that is double pronged. There is such a huge benefit and protection in faith. Absolutely. And faith doesn't resolve mental health issues, especially as we talk. I don't know if we actually mentioned this earlier, but the differences, like, the things that are internal versus things that are external, the things that are caused by things that are happening in our society, the historical things that happen, trauma, racism, things outside of ourselves that create being a student at Purdue, being a faculty or staff at Purdue, and how that creates stress, anxiety, depression, how that might make folks feel isolated and lonely, how might that makes people feel like, you know, they don't have the skills to be here, to do this work, versus the internal things that are biological, and that oftentimes we connect, you know, external things with those internal things. So depression, that's something like, you know, oh, you're depressed because X, Y, and Z, but not because you're actually depressed and there is something going on in which maybe you should seek some treatment about. Same for anxiety, same for bipolar disorder, same for other things. And so I think it's also like that's a part of, you know, the stigma and the values, and how we cope. Comorbidity in the Black community when it comes to mental health and alcoholism, and really talking about what's creating these issues and how we work on it as a community. Because we like to say Black folks are labeled, this negative label, this negative stigma to it, but we don't acknowledge that racism impacts the way in which Black folks are living our daily lives, from where we live, the education we received, the food we eat, the things that we have access to and resources to, and the things that we don't. And so if you're struggling with trauma and in your community you don't have access to mental health therapists that look like you, or you don't have access to any type of resources, you might be forced into another way to cope instead of a way that folks who have resources and access and actually trust the system, because that's a whole nother part of the conversation, trusting the work that mental health providers do. Having access and resources to those things are really, really important. And not having access can be really, really damaging.
You brought up a lot, Maime. There's a lot of doors in what you just said. And I will just say, I think having a spiritual practice is important for those who connect to that. And there are a lot of folks who don't have a spiritual practice or don't have a connection there. Mine personally is kind of a mix of lots of things. It's ever evolving for me. And I wouldn't go to my spiritual practice if I had an appendicitis, right? Like that's not where you go for that. And I think because mental health is something that's harder to um, acknowledge, it's harder to really wrap your arms around. We have this tendency to ignore it or go to places for it that where it doesn't belong, right? And I think spiritual practices play a role, like you said, like it's a support and it's not the solution. I also, when you were talking about what happens when you don't have someone that looks like you, it's very difficult to find a psychologist, a therapist, someone that you can be in session with that can work through healing and therapy with you, one that holds identities that are important and has an analysis around racism, right? Has an analysis around how oppression and racism show up in the way that our mental health, how it impacts our mental health. It's really difficult to find folks, like I'm from a really small town and I live in a small community. It is challenging to find folks that can provide the service that you need in a way that is treating the whole of you and not just a part of you, or isn't going to push you down a road that requires you to conform to white culture more, right? So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I would also say that when Black folks in particular are being treated for mental health or in therapy or are diagnosed with something, right? It is often treated differently and can harm the very individual that it should be helping. And we watch this play out all the time with the number of calls that get made and cops show up and someone dies because they were having a mental health crisis. Like it is so layered because there's also this place of not wanting to get diagnosed because it could mean death for folks, right? Like this is not to play with. And so having a space that is safe and actually treats you well and keeps you safe is deeply important in this conversation and is very lacking in many, many communities.
Thank you. And I'm going to borrow your metaphor of talking about their metaphor about so many doors that they opened in their conversation. There are so many things to talk about here. One of the challenges, maybe we'll talk a little bit later about therapy is one vehicle. It is not the only. It is not in the same way that spiritual practices may be helpful or they may not be. Therapy may be helpful or it may not be. But the issue is that one of the issues that I wanted to get back to that Maime brought up was the stigma and giving ourselves permission to be able to talk about and name those things that are weighing upon us, and being able to give them voice in and of itself can be a very empowering experience. And getting some perspective on it can be helpful too. You spoke about leaving the world of academia, and I could hear your eyes rolling from here. And you're right. But being able to talk about that and come to a realization of where you sit and where you do not, or where you feel the most comfortable and empowered, is an important conversation to have. And sometimes finding the resources to pursue goals that are difficult is an important thing. And sometimes it means going into a different direction. But having the conversation, being able to talk about those things is always going to be the first step. Second point that I wanted to mention, though, is an excellent consideration about to whom do we talk? Many of us have a multitude of people in our life spaces. We have people who are like us, and we also have people who are very different from us. And those kinds of conversations can be very, very helpful, partially because I'm not just one person myself. I have parts to me. There's the part of me that's kid who grew up from Brooklyn, New York, and who doesn't deal with Indiana in the same way that I think some other people do. There's the part of me that's a father, and that's a piece that some people don't see. And there are other parts of me that are the therapist, which nobody tends to see except my clients. So there are going to be those elements that we have to deal with, and there may be a range of ways in which we deal with the stigma associated with not being able to do or feeling distressed that we would rather not have. And acknowledging the multiplicity of ways in which we feel those and the multiplicity of ways in which we can go to pursue healing, I think is important for us to keep in mind. It's hopeful.
And that's a really great way to sort of move into the conversation of what does healing look like? What are different ways to pursue healing? And what are some different options? You know, mentioned that therapy isn't the only one. So I'm wondering if we could also talk about that.
I'm going to jump in. I'm just going to say this. Um, there are a lot of ways around healing, and the thing that I'm learning in my own healing journey, for one, like, healing is never fully attained in my perspective. Like, we just keep going down the road and getting closer to like being our full selves and tending to the wounds that have been left by others, have been left by this world, have been left by generational stuff. Like, we just get further. And my therapist, like I said, she takes me to the mats every other week. But the bulk of my healing work happens on my own. The bulk of my healing work happens between my sessions. There are some folks on this call who would be nodding in agreement if their cameras are on, because they are also like the tenders to my healing process. They're the folks who cultivate the garden of healing that I'm, creating. I think that we make this assumption that therapy fixes all, and therapy is not. It is a guide. It is the mirror. It's the reflection of where we need to do work, and the things that we need to let go of. The bulk of my healing journey has been my own work, and me checking in with like my therapist around what's coming up for me, where I need to move. Reiki is a really great resource. There are lots of books that also help to tap into things. But I think for me, what has been really important, and I recognize that this is also a privilege because not everyone has access to this, and my access to this is limited. But unwinding some of my own history has been deeply healing for myself. And I started it for myself, but I'm watching my family get tapped and touched by some of the things that are coming out of what I'm doing. So there has been a deep personal, I say a confrontation of self that is happening for me personally right now. And that's work that happens between therapy sessions. I have more, but I'm going to stop talking right now so David and Maime can jump in.
Meredith, I just wanted to point out that one of our audience members said, "I love," quote, "cultivating the garden of healing," end quote. That's an excellent expression.
Okay, I'm going to say one more thing. Sorry. I will say, we have so much to learn from the earth around the way the earth takes care of itself, because how we as humans take care of ourselves mimics and mirrors that, but we've lost that. There is a book, The Healing Wisdom of Africa, that is beautiful around ritual. And anyway, that like the earth gives us a lot of clues. How you treat soil that's been contaminated and toxic gives us like the earth is really important when we think about healing.
I agree. And I think that for me, being really holistic, it's important to feel connected to things outside of talk therapy, feel connected to the earth and the environment, and feel connected to myself and my body, my physical body. I think that, you know, one of the things that I find is important in kind of the perspective of healing and what that looks like. I think you hit the nail on the head, like dealing with things like there's an Instagram post where someone was like, and I'm sorry, but Instagram is my therapy most of the time. I follow really therapeutic people who drop dimes, jewels, gold all the time. And so I read a post where someone said, I'm letting go of my ancestors' baggage. I'm letting go of my parents' baggage. I realized that a lot of the ways in which I've been socialized to be is also the places in which my healing needs to reside. My healing needs to exist. The way in which my family taught me certain things about what it is to be Black, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be heterosexual. And as I got older, those things shifted for me. And I said, you know, I don't align with these things. And I had to undo that conditioning. And in that, it was a lot of healing. And I think that sometimes, I would say the biggest lesson for me that has been life altering, being in a PhD program with white peers who consistently achieved greater than I achieved, and would point out how I was different. I always felt like I did not belong. I always felt like I didn't have the mental and emotional capacity and knowledge, competence, intelligence to be in this place, to earn this degree, despite the fact that it's a blood right, despite the fact that my ancestors have lived and toiled on this earth for me to be here, for me to receive this success. And that part of this is, you know, a privilege. Less than 1% of the population are Black folks with doctorate degrees. And so in that comes a lot of work. And my healing came around, and the work that I was doing, I realized that I was in survival mode most of the time and not thriving. And thriving was something that was inexistent, wasn't a word in my vocabulary. I was constantly reacting to everything around me. I was constantly in this space of, I'm just trying to put one foot in front of me so that I can get where I'm going. I'm trying to eat. I'm trying to, you know, pay my bills. I'm trying to survive. And in that survival, there is no space for anything else. And then I was really hard on myself because of that, because I'm surviving. So if I mess up, we all mess up. If I mess up, how can I feed X, Y, and Z? If I lose my job, if I have this experience, and knowing that, and this is like, it brings me back to racism, because Black and brown folks don't have the privilege to mess up like white folks do. And so there's oftentimes this perfectionism that comes up, this desire to be and to do things right. Whew, y'all. I had to really learn how to really take on self-compassion. That was the first thing. And like you said, Meredith, it doesn't always look like sitting in a chair talking to a mental health therapist. I'm a mental health therapist. I'm a therapist at CAPS. And I love sitting and talking with my students. And I think that oftentimes people come and they're like, I had this happen to me. I need you to fix it. And the thing is, it doesn't quite work that way. So we can talk about the things that are going on for you, what you're experiencing. And like you said, there's support that often happens outside of the therapy room. And I think part of what we can do, going to therapy is important. Talking to me, hello, I'm here, is important. Like, come to CAPS, come talk to other therapists at CAPS that really embody social justice, multiculturalism, and are ready to have these conversations with students. And it's also important to meditate, to be mindful, to practice self-compassion. Tracy Ellis Ross said, gentle, gentle, gentle. I'm not going to force myself into this acknowledgement of these terms that could be potentially helpful, but feel like a lot of pressure to embody. Gentle, gentle, gentle. And I just feel like that is something that's so important to hold as Black people, to be gentle, because the world is already putting all this pressure on us anyway. So being gentle with ourselves can be really, really healing in our just navigation of life itself, the task at hand, and healing, in our journey towards healing and what that looks like, what that feels like. I think also the physical part of healing, breath work. I think that when that Black Breath Project, when they talk about breathing, noticing the physiological differences in your breath, in your body when you breathe, is something that, as I said before, we don't really tap into, have access to, as far as making sure that we're breathing, making sure that, you know, we have moments to be mindful. Some of these things are definitely an access thing, a resource thing. And some of these things we can learn and embody within ourselves. And so how do we do that? I think we'll have some resources on that too.
I'm gonna stop. I swear I'm gonna stop talking after this. But I want to say something about thriving, Maime, because I keep asking this question around, like, how do we define success? Who gets to define success? What does that actually look like? And thriving and success feel very similar to me. And I would say that, you know, in my previous life, when I worked at a college, a lot of people would have said I was thriving. You know, I was in a role that was a leadership role. I was sitting on all these, what I would say, useless committees, and I was doing all of this work, and I was raising 2 kids, and I was doing it all by myself, and I was making good money, right? And I was making more money than anyone in my immediate family ever had, right? More than both my parents combined. And people would look at me and say that I was thriving, but I was miserable, and I was a terrible mom, and I was exhausted, and I was angry, and I was overworked, and I turned into the worst version of myself because I was grinding so hard. And thriving requires you to pause, in my experience, and to get really deeply in touch with yourself and figure out who you are, what you want, where you should be, where you should go, and what your healing looks like. And so many times we define thriving by material things and by wealth, which is really again, like a white social, like it's capitalism, right? But we define thriving that way. So when folks, particularly Black folks, step back to take care of ourselves, we don't recognize emotional and mental well-being and health as thriving. Like, we don't define it that way. And so it feels really important to talk about thriving and redefining what thriving actually looks like, because by definition of the constructs we live under, it is killing us. That version of thriving is killing us.
Yeah, so separating that thriving from success and the ways that we can thrive that aren't connected to our success in any way.
And I think we have to, one of the things that this part of the conversation brings up is there's also some subtle navigating that has to be done between, because we don't do this on our own. I think one of the things we've been talking about is the importance of talking, and of getting in touch with ourselves. That means relationships can be healing, but relationships can also be stigmatizing or reinforcing some of the stressors that we need to have. That one of the things that often happens with therapy is that as people change, their relationships change. You need to let go of relationships that are not being healthful for them, or they need to delve more deeply into relationships that are promoting their growth and healing. There are some psychologists, there are some therapists who argue that you probably never should do individual therapy because all of our work is on this earth is played out in relationships, not by ourselves in isolation. So all of these speak to the importance of making some subtle distinctions and being able to think through how these work and how these look in our own spaces. And those may be very individual to us. It may be very individual to the kinds of circles that we inhabit. And they may speak very specifically to the kinds of burdens that we each carry, and that are embodied in our struggles. And what striving looks like, what thriving looks like, what failure looks like, and what we perceive to be the consequences of that in our lives. These are complicated questions. And no one should feel bad for struggling with them. They are difficult. They're at the foundation of much of human life. These are things that we should be thinking about.
I think it's important to add to that. Therapy can look different for many folks. I think that it's important to understand, honor, and value the differences in cultural, ethnic, presentation, representation in the therapy room. I can say that oftentimes, if we were in person, and I haven't been in person at CAPS with people in my office yet, so I don't know if this is, I don't know about these rules about the space. But I typically have candles. I typically have sage. I typically have my incense. I have my crystals, and I honor the spiritual connection between all of these things, between the energy that's present in the room, between my ancestors, between my clients' self and like who they are, their whole self, their spiritual self, their religious self. I think it's important, intersectionality is important to understand and recognize. Me as a Black, queer, non-binary person, that really, my identity shows up. And I think it's important for others' identity to show up as well. And so therapy can look different based on the person. And I think it's important that we shift as therapists to meet the needs of the clients that's in front of us and meet the needs for them in the ways that they need the things that are connected to them in particular, even if we don't feel connected to it. I think that's important for us to understand on a much deeper level the importance of community. So for Black folks, I think that, we can talk about individual therapy and the importance of it. And I definitely co-sign that 100%. Yes, go talk to a therapist, seek some clarity, some, dialogue. I think therapy doesn't always have to be about this is an issue I have going on and, it's something that's so drastic. Therapy can do that, absolutely. And therapy can be a sounding board to talk about all these things that are going on in your life in which you don't have access or resources to have some guidance, some clarity. You can't talk to someone without getting negative feedback back or judgment or worry or concern about what's going on, what you're experiencing. And I think that's important. And I think it's important that, we shift that too for different groups of people. So if community is important, doing community-based groups for folks, identity-based group for folks, really reaching folks where they are. And I truly believe that a lot of the work that we do isn't really necessarily in the room, but it's outside of the room. How are we building bridges, building connections, healing? Because psychology has its own twisted, sordid history and past. And so it's important to recognize how that impacts today, and the perceptions of psychology and therapy and folks coming into therapy, especially Black and Brown folks, and the myths around that, the stigma around that. But it's important to show up for people in their spaces, and connect with not only them, but the people around them. I think that sometimes in the Black community, it's not about what you say, Meredith, but it's about your connection with your children, what your mama and them say, what your daddy and them say, what your auntie and uncles and them say, and how can I meet all of those folks and all of your needs within that group, recognizing that it's bigger than you. And I think that oftentimes we talk about collectivism, and we talk about that with certain cultures, but we don't really talk about that with Black folks. I don't know if I've been in spaces where we talked about collectivistic ideology among Black and Brown people, or Black people specifically. But I think it's really important, because I might call my mom and say, hey, Mom, this is a conversation I just had with my therapist, and my mom might say, don't go back to that person. My mom might say, that person is, that don't make no sense, baby, don't, but how are we gonna really engage in the work? I think it's important to understand our family's dynamic, our cultural dynamic, our community dynamic. And I also say, since I'm talking about therapy specifically, I always find it really important to give someone 3 chances. 3 chances. Then you don't have to give them more than that. You don't have to give them 3 chances. But I think that sometimes we go into a therapy setting, and we have this encounter with this person, and we automatically form a negative judgment of them, or think, oh, this person can't help me. I like to give it 3 chances so that you can really get to understand a deeper level of what this person is meaning, what their intentions are, where their knowledge and awareness is around what you are dealing with, and how they might be potentially able to help you, even though maybe they said something that was challenging, and noticing and recognizing a challenge versus, something that might be completely invalidating, or working through invalidation and naming that. I think therapy can be a space where you find your voice in naming the things that someone is doing that is harmful, which can be a practice for sure.
Absolutely. Just to riff on that, Maime, I think that therapy is like any other human interaction in that regard. We bring parts of ourselves, we see where we fit, where we don't, and working through the places where there might be some difficulties is part of the healing work. As I said, some of our family therapy colleagues, some of our group therapy colleagues say that there's no point in doing one-on-one work because there are so many different ways in which we need to work through different kinds of relationships. I would presume that someone who comes to see you in therapy is going to get a different experience and maybe focus on and experience and come to terms with different parts of themselves than if they went to see Meredith or if they came to see me, because we're different people and we are authentically going to be ourselves as therapists in those kinds of spaces. So giving people time, giving relationships time to work out, to see the healing potential in them is an important piece of it. The same would go, I know folks who look for churches or houses of worship. They look for a place where they can feel connected. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. Certainly in romantic relationships, people sort of take time to figure out what works for them. Students work out majors and where they're going to spend their academic time based on what feels comfortable over time, but giving it time and allowing ourselves to see what pieces we can grow from given the particular context, is an important piece of this. And so in doing so, sometimes we grow the most from people who are very much like us, and sometimes we grow the most from people who are absolutely nothing like us. And those can be, both of those can be healing given our concerns.
Absolutely. And I think that, like, one, advocating for ourselves in therapy is important. My therapist was white for a long time, and I had to check her a few times about how she presented in therapy. But once we got past that, I had the most healing, the most profound healing I could have had in this experience with her, because she offered something that I really, really deeply needed at that time, and she was great at that. And so navigating the racial dynamics in session, really bringing those out and having a conversation was really important. And I think that that can exist. And so I want to say, like, for folks who are interested in therapy, and, you know, CAPS is a resource. We do have therapists of color, and we do have therapists who are white, who are social justice oriented, who are multicultural, who are ready to have conversations, difficult conversations, and really do the work with students. And so part of it is ask for what you want. If you come to CAPS and you have an initial consultation, and I've been asked this question by a few folks, you can, at the end of that initial consultation, ask for someone who you have a preference for, whether it's Black or brown therapists, whether it's a gender preference, whether it's a queer therapist, or someone that can really help assist you in something that you're looking for. And noting that sometimes, like David said, the difference is important too, because difference doesn't necessarily mean bad, doesn't necessarily mean that person won't get it or understand. And there's a lot of folks at CAPS that will get it and will understand, even if they haven't had that lived experience. And so I think that's important. But saying, this is who I would like to talk to. This is the person that I'm interested in continuing therapy with. And you have that choice. And if you're not interested in pursuing therapy at CAPS, we do have social work specialists who can help. I'm getting this name wrong, and I'm pretty sure Kyle's on here frowning at me. We have social work folks who can help folks get connected to therapists in town, a therapist in Indiana, whether it's other therapists of color or other therapists who have specialties in which folks are looking for. And so we can actually pass that resource along in the chat as we wrap up this conversation.
And I think there's questions in the chat, right?
Yeah, I was just waiting for a good moment to address that. Yeah, we've got some questions that have come through from the chat, and I wanted to start with one that was sent a little while ago. Janica asks what letting go of things that don't serve us might look like, especially for students who may see it as failure / quitting, but really for all of us though.
So I was noticing this, which is why I asked you about it. And I also, the second question from Veronica, they feel connected to me around thriving and grit and what happens with students. I worked in what we called student services, but with student affairs. So I see this a lot, and those two feel very connected. I would say, and I'm going to stumble through this, the system of education and the system of success in this country is not set up for folks who look like us to thrive. It's just not, period. And being able to know that consciously and know yourself in that, and being able to show yourself grace around the areas in which you don't measure up or areas in which you let go areas that appear as failing. And I say appear intentionally because it's not actual failing. Being able to distinguish the difference between what is a cultural expectation that was never designed to fit me and actually harms me versus I kind of have to do this thing in order to survive in this country. Like, though, I'm trying to find the best way to talk about this. I think it's a careful conversation. It's a holding space, right? It is us learning how to give ourselves permission to not live up to standards that were never designed for us to live up to in the first place, right? Never. And, you know, as we're socialized from before we're born all the way through our lives, we're repeatedly told, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that what we do isn't good enough, which is why we often have to outperform and we do all these things, right? We are living in an environment where that is constantly being pounded into our psyche, and protecting yourself and standing up for yourself and advocating for yourself and choosing not to let that dictate how you see yourself is a constant work. I can tell coaching clients all day to have grace with themselves and to not let constructs define them and not let the expectations of the system define them. And I know this consciously too about myself, but I don't believe it really in my heart. Like, I have to work at that every single day, every day. I have to constantly work at the feeling, I have to constantly work at my need for validation. I have to constantly work at my comfortability with being myself. I have to constantly work, at the fact that I have value. I bring something to the table. I am important. I'm a healer. I'm all these things. And the very things that I am are often discounted and invalidated in this society. So when I think about like students trying to get through a system that was not designed for them and them being awarded and being seen as valuable if they're able to survive it and navigate, right? I think the conversation lives in how we come alongside them and support them and give them permission to not have to live up to those standards. It took someone pointing that out to me and telling me I needed to give myself that permission for me to even start thinking about it. And so I think for those of us who know this and know better, it's our job to help other folks give themselves the permission to not have the grit sometimes, to not live up to outrageous expectations, to not feel like they have to outperform and overachieve and do so much, and to give ourselves permission to take care of ourselves and to say no and to not do certain things. I don't know, Maime, Dr.
I was going to say those boundaries. I think oftentimes we forget that we have the power to have boundaries, and oftentimes we are made to feel like we don't have the power to make boundaries or set boundaries. When you're in an institution like Purdue, I was saying this, I probably have been saying this, it's like you're required to work from 8 to, sleeping, like from when you wake up to when you go to sleep. I get emails all the time on the weekends, and I'm just like, I'm not answering that. It can wait until Monday. And so setting boundaries around your day, setting boundaries around your time, and really like understanding people will always feel entitled to your time, especially if you are underneath them. If you're working, if you're a student, there's always going to be somebody who's saying, hey, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. I need it at this time. I need it at this. And it's hard when you are in a position where you don't have the power to reject that, to say, I'm not going to do that. I need to take care of myself. And when you can do that, when you can set that boundary, when you can take that time, it's important to do so. There are folks who haven't taken any vacation at all. You have 50 million vacation hours. There are folks who can't seem to break away from their phones, their computers, their emails. It's okay to do that. At the end of the day, your health, your mental, physical, and emotional health is the most important. And in this institution, the institution will replace you if you are dead tomorrow. I hate to say it, but the institution will replace you if you are dead tomorrow. So how do we live and thrive within ourselves? And I think that point of disconnecting failures and success, one thing that I know, so I just recently finished my internship, and I interviewed at 17 sites, had all these interviews, and I ranked my top 5 places. I matched at my number 4 site, which was University of North Carolina, Charlotte. It was my number 4 spot. It was not my first, my second, or my third. I was devastated. And I thought, oh my God, I am a failure. I could not rejoice in the fact that I matched, which is something people don't match for internship, right? So I couldn't rejoice in that because it wasn't my number 1 spot. My number 1 spot was Duke, and I harbor some resentment towards Duke. I know we got some Duke people on the call. I'm looking at you, Duke. No, I'm kidding. But I know that that's something that kind of sat with me for a long time because I felt like, here's this site that I really, really wanted and they didn't want me. I'm a failure. When I tell you I had the best time of my life at UNC Charlotte, I had the most growth, the most care, the most concern over my whole life. I see you, Janica. And it was so important and impactful. And that failure of not getting that number 1 spot was probably the best thing that I could have gotten, the best thing that could have happened to me in that moment. And it set me up to be exactly where I am right now. So sometimes those failures are blessings. I know that's an old biblical saying, right? Sometimes those failures are things that propel you forward, but they're not the end. They're not the breaking point. They're not the finish. And I think that sometimes it's important to acknowledge, I went through this experience. I didn't get what I wanted. I failed this test. This and that happened. That failure does not embody you as a person. It's not who you are. So we can disconnect the thing, right? You failed this thing. That's separate. You failed that test. You failed that class. That doesn't make you who you are. You are not a failure. So if we can disconnect this sense of what we do, how we perform from ourselves and how we think and feel about ourselves, that's so important in shifting that feeling of failure and quitting, and how we navigate that, how we navigate this disappointment.
Yeah, thank you. That was a lot, but it was a lot that was really on point. And I hope everyone has had some revelations going through this. I know I have. I'd like to address the second part. Veronica Rahim submitted a second part to her initial question, which is for faculty and staff. In addition to the Center for Healthy Living, what are additional resources available to identify options for a therapist? I imagine since many therapists are offering virtual services, does that expand the reach of access to therapists, especially those of color?
So I would say yes. The fact that that therapy is virtual does expand the reach. You can do therapy here in Lafayette with someone in Indianapolis virtually. And so in some ways that it does. I always use Psychology Today. It's a great resource. And I'll add some links to pages, websites that are dedicated to finding Black and Brown therapists. Most of these websites are national, so they kind of are amalgamation of all these different therapists of color in different places. I think that it's hard to find therapists, especially as a faculty or staff here at CAPS, we serve the students. And so we do have resources to help faculty and staff and to help other people find resources outside of therapy at CAPS. So, and I said this wrong earlier, I'm going to correct myself because I think that's, that's one of the things that we do. Our clinical case managers are really good at helping folks connect therapists outside of CAPS. Therapists within Lafayette, West Lafayette, but also within Indiana. And so Thriving Campus is something that's on our website that you can find that also can help folks find therapists in the city or in where are we? Indiana. And so it's a great resource as well. I forgot for a moment where we were. Oh, it's actually, it helps you find therapists across the US. So it's a really great resource, Thriving Campus, which I can add that link into the chat box now.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll add that to our resource guide as well. There is an entry in the resource guide that's a national directory put together by, I believe it was 2 Black women who decided that there needs to be a national directory, and that resource is on the guide, on the library guide that I created. I don't see any additional questions in the chat, and we're really we're over time just by a couple of minutes. So I wonder if there are any final thoughts that each of you would like to share with our audience. I think just looking at the number of participants throughout this entire event, people have clearly been very engaged, and I think that people are getting a lot out of this. So I just want to thank you once again for your time and turn it over to y'all for some last thoughts.
One of the pieces that I resonated with from Maime's couple of statements that she'd made before is agency, that people have capacity to make change. As Meredith very succinctly and accurately put it, there are many systems in which Black folks live that were definitely not made for us, and in some instances were set up specifically against us. But there is agency. For example, the Black Caucus of Faculty and Staff puts on an awards program every year because we know that sometimes systems fail to recognize African-American excellence where it is. So we do it. Again, we've talked about the range of different places where people may go for assistance to work out, to think through, to navigate the challenges that they experience. And that's real. It may not be a therapist. It may not be a therapist who looks like you, looks like me, looks like what you originally thought a therapist would look like. But there are always going to be options. And agency allows one to figure those kinds of things out. And the third thing I'll say in that same space of agency is that there are things that define African-American life, that define Black life, that bring joy. I started my class this semester on a graduate class by reading Maya Angelou's And Still I Rise. It's about the things that allow us to survive, to thrive, to make change, and the capacity to make change and the resources to doing so also are things that are within our grasp. Things are difficult. This is not debatable. It's not unclear. But there are also resources, and the fact that folks are here, I'm honored to be serving with a moderator and 2 panelists who are exquisite human beings who can articulate those kinds of issues and concerns. Says to me that agency, the possibility of making use of the resources that are out there is possible, and change is possible.
I'm just going to really quickly say, personally, I think when it comes to healing, I owe it to, folks who came before me that have continued to pour into me, that pour into me from other places. I owe it to the folks that are coming after me to heal. But I also know for myself, healing was also a worth issue. I had to really get to a point where I believed I was worth healing. I was worth love. I was worth shifting things. And that it's not a linear process. It is not a step-by-step linear journey. However, it's a journey that is can be sustainable with the right resources and community around you. And for me has been life-changing and life-giving in the most beautiful ways. And so I would just say that healing will always be the biggest goal of my life. It will always be the thing I'm always centered and focused on, always.
I just want to add to that. One, I'm so incredibly thankful to Eula and the BCC and to my panelists, David and Meredith, for doing this with me. It was an incredible experience to walk through this presentation and to have these really impactful discussions, even amongst ourselves. So I'm so glad that we're able to bring this to a wider group of people. I want to say that CAPS, we are a resource, folks. So know that I myself, we have other therapists of color on staff and other therapists who are willing to show up for folks. And so we are a resource. Feel free to use us. You can call and give us a call. It's a free service for students. So feel free if you have any, I don't know, if you just want to talk to someone. I think that a few things are important to also add to that. Currently, we have two groups for Black and Brown folks. One is a BIPOC USO group, and the other is a multicultural women's empowerment group. If you're interested in that, you can check it out on our website, and you can also give us a call and ask for some assistance. We are a resource. I am a resource. I'm here. And I'm grateful to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity and the journey. Healing is really, really important, and literally, quite literally, our lives depend on it. And so take the time to engage in things that center around yourself and your healing, your journey, your growth. Your wellness, your well-being, and know that all of those things are connected. Your mental, physical, and emotional selves are all connected. And so it's important that we take care of all of those things and honor all those things. And you're worth it. You deserve it. You deserve compassion. I tell this to everybody who is a client of mine. You've heard me say it. You deserve compassion. You deserve gentleness. You deserve loving kindness. Take it. Breathe. You deserve the breath that you have. Honor that breath and breathe. Breathe into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. If you're able to look at the chat, there's just all kinds of people saying thank you and how much they appreciate. Yeah, it's just pouring in. So Meredith, Dr. Rollock, Maime, if you're able to just glance at that chat and see the appreciation that's coming in for your time and your expertise and for being a part of this tonight. Thank you so much. I've opened all of the links that were shared, and I'll be adding those to the resource guide. And I hope that we can do this again that this can manifest in another form in the future. So thank you all. Have a good evening.